About a week after that meeting, I was in New York for a mediation with the financial creditors. We were keeping very secret this idea of what became the Grand Bargain. I should talk about how it got the moniker Grand Bargain. We didn't invent it, but I had breakfast with Darren. Had breakfast with Darren Walker, and he had a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. He also had a blow up of a New Yorker cartoon on the wall in his office, which was, I'll never forget this. It was a young man with a bushel basket full of cash standing in the window throwing it out, and an older guy running up to him and saying, wait a minute, that's not how we do it at the Ford Foundation. And his message was very clear. They weren't going to just throw money at this if there wasn't a good prospect for success. And Darren and I had a very robust conversation. And, it was one of the key points of the bankruptcy, because later, I'll never forget this, on December 9th, I came in from a sentencing from my court, and it was a tough sentencing, lots of family and lots of emotion in the courtroom, and I wasn't feeling great. And my secretary, Donna, rang in and said, Darren Walker's on the line. And I thought, oh boy. And he said, Judge, my board is inspired by your idea, and we're going to make the largest grant we've ever made in Ford history. I had no idea what that was. I said, I was speechless. I said, great, Darren. And he said, Ford is going to contribute $125 million. I almost fell out of my chair. And I said the first thing that came to my mind, which was, Darren, when the history of this bankruptcy is written, you're going to be the hero. And he said, no, Judge. He said, this is a team effort. You're going to be hearing from all of my colleagues who are at the meeting. And I believe, if not all of them, almost all of them are going to participate. And I just started getting all these calls. And by Wednesday, I had $291 million. And in an assetless bankruptcy, that's money. So I leveraged that, and I called the governor, told him I needed to meet with him. And Eugene and I drove up to Lansing on a very snowy morning and met with the governor and some of his staff. And I had, prepared what I was going to say. And I should say the governor has both an accounting degree, a law degree, and a business degree. He's a very smart guy. Yeah. I had sort of choreographed in my mind how I was going to roll this out. And I started off by saying, you made a very courageous decision, Governor, to put the city into bankruptcy. It was a decision that was long overdue, and a decision that had been kicked down the road by all of your predecessors and swept under the rug. I said, but you can't throw up your hands now and say, not my problem. I said, you bought into this process, you created it. You can't just walk away from it. And I said, we're not getting anywhere with any of the creditors. We have no assets other than the art. Nobody thinks it's a great idea to liquidate the museum. And nobody really wants to do it, but we have no other assets to get deals with. And I said, but we're getting some traction now on this idea. By this time it had gotten into the media, despite the fact that I had stressed confidentiality, which was a whole different story. It caused me a lot of heartburn, but in the end, it actually turned out to be a good thing. But we're starting to get some traction, and I started keeping kind of a tally sheet of the commitments we were getting from all the foundations. But I told him I had gotten an email the day before from Rip Rapson, who was president of the Kresge Foundation, speaking for all the foundations, that there were a number of conditions. First and foremost, that the state had to participate in a significant way, because the foundations didn't want to be the only ones funding this. And I thought that was reasonable, but also a difficult ask, but also a way I could maybe leverage that. And, Darren had kind of alluded to that in our breakfast meeting that morning, a 3 weeks before, that this might be the position that they were going to take. So I said, I said, yeah, we're starting to get some participation. Uh, and first thing I said, I led with the headline. I said the Ford Foundation has committed 125 million, and the governor, he was a pretty good poker player, but he said, really? I said, yeah. And I said, Kresge's committed 100 million. He said, really? I said, yes. And I went down the list, and I was going to roll out the total with a little bit of drama. But as I said, he's an accountant. He was already there. He said, so you've got $291 million. I said, yes. I said, but I have to tell you, it's all conditional on the state participating. And I said, Rick, you and I know that this is an assetless bankruptcy. And if we leave this money on the sidelines, this will eventually leach out, and we will all be weighed by history in the balance and found wanting. I said, we can't leave this money on the sidelines. He said, and he started asking questions. As I said, he's a pretty sharp guy. And he looked at me and he said, how much do you think you're going to get from the foundations? Because we still had about 5 or 6 outstanding. And I said, I really can't say, but I think there's a good likelihood we'll get to at least 350 million. So he said, He said, so what are you asking? I said, I think you've at least got to match that. I was prepared for this. I said, I think you've at least got to match that. And he said, he said, this was really the big question. He said, do you think it's going to be enough? He said, if we match, do you think it's going to be enough? And that was really the penultimate question. He said, and he also said, if I have to go to the legislature, which was controlled by not just the Republican Party, both houses, but there was a significant, at the time, Tea Party component, very conservative, outstate folks who were not anxious to bail out Detroit. So he said, this is going to be very difficult, and we're only going to get one shot at this. You can't come back and retrade me and tell me you need more. I said, I know that. And then he said, do you think it's going to be enough? And, who knew? So I looked over at Eugene, at the time, I think was 77 or 78, had wispy hair and very bushy gray eye. He looked kind of like Yoda. And I still remember Eugene sitting there with his eyes scrunched up, just kind of nodding, say yes. So I said, if we get 350 from the foundations and 350 from the state, it'll certainly be a start. I said, we're going to need more. But I said, I think if we get another 100 million from other sources, like private donors, corporations, the DIA, I said, we'll make it work. It was a little bit of a leap on my part because I certainly didn't know we'd make it work. But he didn't hesitate. He reached over, we shook hands, and that was it. As we were going out of his office, his legislative liaison, who had to sell this deal to the legislature, who was an old friend of mine, he had been lieutenant governor of the state, he'd been a state senator, pulls me aside, he puts his arm around me and he says, Jerry, he says, I heard what the governor said, but you have no idea how difficult this is going to be. And either does he. And I said, I know, Dick, but Dick Posthumus is his name. I said, I know, but failure isn't an option here. I don't have a plan B. This is the only train out. And I said, I'll come up. Eugene and I'll come up. Eugene was very active in the Democratic Party. I still at the time had some ties to the Republican Party, even though I was certainly not active by any means, but knew a lot of people. I said, Eugene and I'll come up. We'll meet with every legislator, which ultimately we did. And we can't fail. And of course, when all of this was announced, that the governor had committed $350 million, all the pundits said, never happened. Nice idea, but never happened. We got overwhelming majorities in both the House and the Senate. And for me, one of the most emotional moments in the bankruptcy was when State Senator Tom Casperson, who's now passed away, great guy, but very conservative, from the Upper Peninsula, stood up and said, "Today, we're all Detroiters." So it passed overwhelmingly.
Wow. Wow. That is absolutely incredible. Judge, we're beyond the time I said I would take with you, but I was
Yeah, I'm
wondering.
looking at my calendar because I think I have an 11 o'clock. So
Okay, so
oh, I've got a. It's not 11. It's noon.
Okay, so if I could get, without imposing on too much of your time here, if I could maybe have you think a little bit or talk with us a little bit about the lessons of Detroit for other mediations in bankruptcy. Let's say, business bankruptcies with, complex plan out there. Any lessons generally we could take?
Yeah, I mean, particularly for mediators, as I said, I'm a Churchill guy, so my motto is never give up. At the beginning of any mediation, you'll hear no, never, all the time from all the parties. So, I have an opening statement that I make in the mediations, and it goes something like this. I tell people, I don't have a lot of rules, but I do have one firm rule, and that is nobody uses the F word, final offer.
Ha.
And it's very true. If I had listened to the lawyers in Detroit when they said, this is our final offer, and banged their laptops shut, Detroit would still be in bankruptcy. So never give up. I think another important rule is that when the parties try to present you with a binary equation, either this or that, and that happens a lot in bankruptcies, don't accept it. Don't accept it. Get the parties involved in a process with you to try to help think your way out of the binary box that they're trying to put you in. And bankruptcies are tough. Every case is tough, whether it's in bankruptcy or not. Bankruptcies are particularly tough, especially large bankruptcies, because there are often so many creditors. And, it's a little like musical chairs. I don't know how well this metaphor works. I'm just sort of thinking of it. But when the music stops, there aren't enough chairs to go around to all the people, all the creditors, and people are fighting for chairs. And so bankruptcies are particularly tough. I often feel in these multi-party mediations, whether in bankruptcy or not, but I often feel that I'm playing 5-level chess, because I've got whatever you do with one party impacts what another party is going to get, because it's limited assets.
Wow.
So those are my, sort of top of the hat suggestions, but, there are many other suggestions. Never give up. I mean, just keep talking. A good mediator has to have patience and perseverance, and then more patience and more perseverance. I guess I do have an approach to mediation. It's the 4 C's. Candor. The mediator has to be candid, and the parties have to be candid with the mediator, and they have to be candid with themselves. Very often, whether in a bankruptcy or not, the parties are in denial. They've fallen in love with their own arguments, and they're in denial. And I always tell them, this is a line I got from Steve Rhodes, but denial is a river in Egypt. It's not a solution to a problem. And then the second C is cooperation. Very often, again, in bankruptcies or not, there's a lot of scar tissue that has developed between the parties. Maybe it's a corporate divorce. In the Detroit bankruptcy, there was huge scar tissue. Everybody was angry at the city, and everybody told us stories about how the city had been screwing them for years, in some cases decades. So everybody was angry. And you have to let that process kind of ventilate for a while and let the scar tissue ventilate. But in the end, I think it's important that the mediator try to focus the parties on what the real issues are, not just the scar tissue and how those issues came to be, but what the issues are on possible paths to resolution. And that often will have the effect of getting parties in a more cooperative mode. So that's the second C, cooperation. You know, the third C is creativity. You got to be creative in these tough bankruptcies, and not just the mediator. The mediator's got to encourage a free, robust flow of ideas from the parties. Because when you start thinking outside the box that the parties are trying to put you in, and get the parties to think outside that box, good things happen. And that happened in the Detroit bankruptcy. Every deal we did had its own creativity to it, not just the grand bargain, not just the UTGO deal, which was very creative, but every deal we did. The water department deal, we took the Detroit water and sewer department and we made it a regional authority with representation from the suburbs. And from that, we got $113 million for infrastructure and $50 million a year, $50 million a year for 40 years to fund infrastructure repair, which the water system and sewer system desperately needed. That was a very creative deal. And my colleague, Sean Cox, I had appointed him the mediator in that because he had the water and sewer case itself. And I had appointed him the mediator, and they came up with very, very creative ideas. Kevin Orr, the mayor of the city of Detroit, Mike Duggan, the Oakland County executive, the Macomb County executive, the Wayne County executive. That was truly a team effort, one of the toughest mediations, but people got very creative in that. So the third C rather, is creativity. And the fourth C is courage. Not just the mediator, but the parties. You know, in every deal, somebody's got to take a leap of faith. So every deal, somebody's got to take that first step. And, you know, the mediator's job is to create an environment where people don't feel like they're losing face or giving up something if they take that step. And in Detroit, everybody showed courage. The bondholders and their insurers, certainly the retirees, the state, by coming in the way it did, every deal the state was part of. The city, Kevin Orr, Kevin was really the real hero of the bankruptcy, because not only did he have to deal with me and the bankruptcy, but he had to run the city at the same time, which was a huge deal. But, you know, courage, all of these deals, it took a lot of courage for the foundations to do something they had never done before. And every foundation made the largest single grant they had ever made, every one of them. So that was unusual. And then I want to say one other thing, because there's always a human element to these. You know, I told you I was very focused on trying to keep this idea that my mediation team and I had talked to the foundations about at this meeting, and I did not want it in the media because, well, several reasons. I was afraid that if it got into the media, the board of these foundations would get cold feet. And more importantly, because I was taking the only asset the city had and giving it just to the retirees, I knew the financial creditors were going to be very upset. And unfortunately, it leaked after 8 days, it leaked out. And the reporter for the Detroit News, who was on the story, who was a good friend of mine, I had actually performed his wedding just a few months before, called me, and, you know, I could tell he was very nervous. And he said, you know, we're sort of hearing about what went on in the room with the foundations, and I want to run it past you. And I thought, oh shit, excuse me. I said, we're screwed. So Dave Shepherdson started spooling it out. And over the years, Dave had covered a lot of stories about the court cases we had. And we had developed a protocol that if he was, if he was off, if he was just, the story was just off, I would tell him he needed to do more reporting. But if he had the story, I would say, can't comment. So he spooled it out, and the more he spooled it out, the more I knew the cat was completely out of the bag. And I started pleading with him not to run the story. I told him what I thought would happen if he ran the story, and he said what every reporter says, which is, well, if we don't run it, everybody's chasing the story. Somebody else is going to run it, and I'm calling you because I want to make sure it's accurate. And the usual stuff reporters give you. And I said, David, you have no idea how bad this is going to be. I said, but I can't wave you off the story. And I called my neighbor and close friend, the publisher of the Detroit News, John Woolman, who's just passed away, unfortunately. He was out in Seattle, and I tried to get him to spike the story, and he laughed and he said, I'm surprised the story held for 8 days, Jerry. So I thought we were really screwed, but I buried the lead, because here's what happened. So the Free Press, the story came out. I saw it. That was the morning I had breakfast with Darren. He was well aware of the story. It was 5 a.m. It was front and center, top of the fold. And I was worried that Darren was going to tell me, oh no. He said, my board is made of sterner stuff. And, as we talked about it, and he said, no, I think it'll actually be good for the board to know that the story is out there. And I said, okay, I hope so. But then I told you I was in New York to mediate with the financial creditors. And I knew and I got blasted in a very nice, respectful way, but they were not happy at all. So I knew that was going to happen. And then they started fighting it, trying to take the deal apart in many different ways, including in the media, the financial press. But here's what happened. The Free Press was chasing the story, and a reporter called me. And I didn't know him very well, but I knew him. And John Gallagher is his name. And he called me and he said, we're trying to understand what the ramifications of this plan might be. And I told him what the 3 legs of the grand bargain were, and how I hoped that if we could address the retirees, that would get the largest creditor off the runway, and we could then use other assets that the city had, which weren't much, but we could then turn to the other assets. So he kind of paused and just kind of offhandedly said, so this is kind of like a grand bargain. And I said, and this was right after the grand bargain between Speaker Boehner, John Boehner, and President Obama blew up with a lot of recriminations, a lot of fanfare. And I just said, well, I hope ours fares better than the last grand bargain. And he just kind of chuckled. And the next morning, the story appeared front and center, again, top of the fold in the Free Press. And I got this at about 10 o'clock in the morning. I got this very strange email from somebody I'd never heard of. And the email said, I'm inspired by this story, and we'd like to kickstart the funding with $5 million. Wow. And I'd never heard of this guy. So I Googled him, looked him, and his name was Paul Scott. Turned out he was a chemistry professor that invented a firefly molecule that lit up diseased cells. And he turned it into a company that he called Lumigen, and many years later sold it for a fortune. And so I wanted to talk to him and thank him. And I had lunch with him. I called him, talked to him, and we had lunch the next day. And I mean, here's this guy. To me, this was so inspirational, because every day I was in what I called the Shark Tank. I was dealing with some of the toughest, sharpest lawyers and financial experts in the world. And they wanted to take the city apart piece by piece. And here's this very humble, self-effacing, elderly, gray-haired chemistry professor, who all he wanted to do was help his city. He started off, I said, Paul, why are you doing this? He said, my wife and I have been very fortunate. We don't have any children, and everything we've ever had, we owe to the city of Detroit. And the city needs us, and we want to help. I mean, it was, he tried to explain to me what his firefly molecule does. And after, a fog descended, and I told him, I said, Paul, I've got to tell you, I can tell you in 2 words why I went to law school: organic chemistry. And he, he said, well, it's not that interesting anyway. And I said, but if we can get this story out, I think it'll get some legs. And he said, yeah, I've gotten a lot of calls from the media. And that night he was on the news, all the local news, and we started getting contributions from all over the country, all over the world. We got small contributions from Amsterdam, from Paris, and some of the checks were coming to me. I didn't know what to do with them. So I called Miriam.
Was your name on the check?
No. Some of them said art fund, some just said, I said, Miriam, I think we've got to start a fund or something. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I think we got about $300,000 that way, not including Paul's $5 million, which was amazing. I mean, to us in the Shark Tank, the mediators, it was a tonic, because it told us that people cared.
Yeah.
And we're rooting for us.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I just want to thank you for your time.
I called Paul my VW. I don't know if you're an espionage novel fan. Maybe some of your listeners are, but in the spy world, a VW is a virtual walk-in. People who volunteer intelligence to cooperate with intelligence with an email or something, they call them virtual walk-ins. Most of them are worthless, but that's what they're called. So Paul Scott was my he was my VW.
Cool. Well, thank you. This has been fascinating and wonderful, and I appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and close off here. And all those things you said. Here's a great story. Well, I might be back bugging you sometime, but thank you. Appreciate it.
There's a documentary film being made about it, and it's a great film. COVID has delayed it a lot, but it's still going to come out.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'll close off here now.